Hi, and welcome to Ed Talks. My name's Ann Dymond, and I'm a Board of Governors teaching chair here at the University of Lethbridge. I want to start by acknowledging that we're on the lands of the Blackfoot people in what's now Treaty 7 territory. So I also want to say Oki Nitsu Kawawa, which means hello and welcome to our family and neighbors. I'm here today with Chancellor Charles Weaselhead, who is the newly appointed Chancellor of the University of Lethbridge, and so I want to say welcome and thank you for being here, Chancellor Weaselhead.
Thank you very much, Anne, for the invite, and I'm looking forward to our interview and our discussion together today.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's really an honor and a thrill. I want to start, though, with talking about your background. I know before you became chief of the Blood Tribe, you were really focused on health in your career. So can you tell me about that? What drew you to health as a concern, and how did you become involved in that?
Involved in health, I'm still trying to find the answer to that. Sometimes I think I didn't choose the health career. I think health chose me to go into that. So part of that is my upbringing. Mm-hmm. I must say that I had a lot of teachings and directions from my grandfather, the late Pat Weaselhead, And one thing really sticks in my mind, Anne, about my grandfather. He used to tell me to believe in the Creator, to believe in yourself, and to believe in your community, So when I backtrack and take a look at that statement and that teaching from my grandfather, it provides me sort of the direction. And if we want to say career pathways to whatever I have done in the past to where I am today, And I think we must also understand, my upbringing, in my early years, formative years, being at home with my parents and, of course, my family, extended family, which included my uncles, my aunts, and my grandfathers and stuff like that, So it was an experience, up to probably about 6 years old, And so, getting into that transition, from birth to 6 years old,
right. Those early years,
the family, remembering, playing, with my siblings, and just getting to enjoy who I am as an Indigenous person, And so early in life, I was very, very interested and excited about education, about other forms of learnings and stuff like that, So I think, a part of that is why I chose the health career field, because when my grandfather said, believe in yourself, I think it's been always a goal in my life, that I'm very, very interested, and what is important to me is my health and well-being, and I think that's where the attraction to health was, But going back to those years, I think we all also have to understand that transition happened. When I was 6 years old, I was taken away to residential school, So that has a huge impact, with career choice, where you're going in life, and those type of things. And I'll probably expand a little bit later in our discussion together, But again, like I said, it's making a difference individually with yourself and making a difference with your family and your community. And these are the teachings of my grandfather, that I keep close to myself, and that sort of drives me, And I've always had a passion about other people, about other families, and the community,
Right.
I'm so proud of my base, my Indigenous heritage, and my traditions, and my upbringing, And I do know that residential school has a greater impact, than we perhaps understand, especially from the greater population, But I always take a look at the flip side of life all the time, And I take a look at the positive aspects of those type of things, So it was, of course, residential school provided you with a little bit of education, a little bit of security with regards to housing, with regards to having, taken care of throughout the day, I think that's the greatest takeaway from me, But in essence, you will hear the other side of residential school, the abuse that happened. And, if you take a look at it really closely and you take a look at your children or even your children at 6 years old, being taken away to a foreign learning environment, being taken away from your parents and your grandparents, that safety and that security you had up to that age 6 level, So it's a growing experience. It's a harsh experience for the majority of our residential school people, So I think if I jump a little bit further ahead, I think that's the direction that I had in health, And part of that impact is that a lot of our children, our young people that went to residential school had sort of that whole addiction issue problem,
Right.
So these are some of the things that happened as a result of residential school, So I think, we're all caught up in the web of addiction and, other behaviors which weren't becoming of us as Indigenous children that we knew
Right.
what our parents wanted us to be. Right. But nonetheless, over the years, some of us were able to work ourselves through that, And as a part of my learning journey, as a part of my healing journey, I attached myself to the whole field of addiction, So subsequently, I entered the field of addiction as an administrator, number one as a CEO, and number two. But early in life, I began to understand, the personal behaviors that
Right.
weren't right for me. In order for me to advance in my life, in order for me to take care of my own family,
Right.
my own children, my own grandchildren,
Right.
And so, again, like I said, I was a director for a 6-to-6 bed treatment center up in Edmonton, Poundmakers Lodge, and I had the, let me put it this way, I had the luxury of being able to sit with people and understand where they came from, their hurts, their passions, their dreams, their aspirations of where they want to be after they quit their addiction, whether it's alcohol or drugs, and stuff like that, So I think part of that is what drew me to that, trying to make a difference for young people, trying to make a difference for families, and trying to make a difference for the community, So that's part of my history in working with the health and the health of people, And from there, I moved over to back home. I moved back home from Edmonton. I was able to be the administrator for the Bloody Indian Hospital for a number of years, and being able to provide a sort of a safe environment, especially for our older people, So it was similar to a continuing care center, and an old folks home, if I may say that, And so we provided the care with them, And I think, again, just being able to be in that environment, taking care of our older people, listening to their stories, There are plenty of times, I'd visit their room and where they lodged, and I was able to hear the stories of the past and their teachings and stuff like that, So moving forward to that, I was the tribal health director for a number of years, And I think the takeaway and the outcomes of that was, again, being able to see the future, where healthcare was going with our tribe, And I think health is attached to education, and you begin to see sort of the determinants of health, with regards to education, employment, those type of things, So I think it was a strong learning experience, and I began to see, where we needed to go in the healthcare field, Number one, it's similar to education. You need to build your capacity. You need to build your human resource, And I'm so proud to say that today I believe we've got 5 doctors that come from our reserve, and many doctors of different discipline, you know.
Right.
If you take a look at our healthcare system, 95% of our people are employed in the health sector field, you know. And I think we've continued to expand, you know, and take a look at our data, our statistics, you know. Mind you, our data still tells us, you know, that there's a real gap between our health outcomes of our people and the major population.
Right. There's a lot there, and I'm a bit overwhelmed by all you've shared already, particularly your generosity in trying to see the positive in the residential school system. That's kind of breathtaking, actually, such a positive way to move forward. But I want to pick up on your move from a health focus into a more education focus. I know you became, you had a dual portfolio of health and education. And even the way you were talking about it from the beginning of your youth, education and health were linked in both positive and negative ways in residential schools, it seems to me. So can you tell me more about the relationship between health and education for you?
I think, you know, as part of my training, as part of my responsibilities in the health field, whether it was at the administration level, whether it was at the front line, working with people with addictions and that type of thing, you know, I think there was a natural progression into the understanding how education and health align with each other, you know. And so I was fortunate enough, I believe in 2004, that I was elected chief for my tribe, the Blood tribe, you know, and I served three terms of 4 years, you know, 12 years altogether, you know. Right. And as chief, you also have a dual responsibility, not only to provide assistance and guidance and support as chief with your own tribe, but you've got the bigger
larger area
working group in Treaty 6, Treaty 7, Treaty 8 in Alberta, and going nationally, you know. So I was able to pick up and understand, you know, just where the gaps were. And I believe I want to talk about a good friend of mine, the late Minister Jean Swazleski, you know. The late Jean was the Minister of Indigenous Relations back then, I believe in the 2010, 29 era. I'm not quite sure what year that was, you know, but I remember vividly the one day the minister called me and said, Chief, I'd like to sit down with you and sort of talk about the discussions on education, where it's going, where the gaps are, you know, what you see that we can build on, you know. And for me, it was sort of a historic discussion at that time, you know. Minister and Jean said, let's set aside the politics of the situation. Let's set aside all those things that become barriers, you know, for us to talk freely, you know. And so during that time, you know, I think there was an understanding between the minister and myself, you know. There was a huge gap in education, you know. We see our Aboriginal people, you know, not succeeding, you know, in the kindergarten to K-12 aspect of it, you know. The retention wasn't there, you know. As the transition happened from grades kindergarten to grade 4, 5, 6, and from 6 to 9 and 9 to 12, we saw a lot of dropout rates happening, you know. And so we began to sort of understand, you know, what needed to be done, you know. But during that time, you know, the discussion was we need to bring this back to the chiefs, you know, that area chiefs in Treaty 6, 7, and 8. And we need to begin that discussion, you know. How do we work together? How do we collaborate our ideas? And more importantly, going back to that question, and I think there's still more questions and answers in regards to why is there a gap with Aboriginal students not being able to succeed in the K-12 division and in higher education and post-secondary, you know. So I think from there, you know, there was a certain degree of urgency from the chiefs in Treaty 6, 7, and 8 in Alberta. And subsequently, what happened out of that is that we developed a memorandum of understanding on the education portfolio, you know.
Right. Yeah.
And we were able to, be able to bring together both parties, you know, the chiefs, the technicians, our educators, and of course the ministers, and we were able to meet with the Premier twice a year and begin the process of identifying those gaps, you know. And mind you, there's a tremendous amount of literature and papers that are out there and research, you know, why is there a gap in education, you know. And I always kind of take a look at it from my own personal viewpoint, okay?
From your knowledge.
From my knowledge,
your lived experience,
okay? Yeah. And going back to when I was born and being 6 years old, I was in a safe, caring environment.
Yeah.
You know, and every day I lived, you know, with the parents around, you know, your siblings, you know, you're able to play, you're able to sing, you were taught, you know, who you were as an Indigenous person. And all of a sudden you went to school, you know. You began to see the different world, you know, and the cultural differences and stuff like that, you know. And I think, you know, earlier, like I said, I want to remain positive about residential school, but in some areas, you know, you need to understand there's a great deal of insensitivity to who we are, you know.
Well, and ongoing effects.
Of course,
yes.
Of course, the whole assimilation process, you know.
Right.
We didn't have the ability. We were demanded not to talk our own language, you know, to each other, and we were punished for that. Just one example of that, you know. And being a 6-year-old, you know, after the first week, I wondered when my parents were coming home, you know. So why I want to make those statements is, again, understanding what happens to our young people, you know, when they move to a different school, and some of those same things, you know, aren't there for them to succeed, you know. But I guess, you know, in contrast, you know, at this point in time, you know, our young generation right now that are going to school, you know, have a lot of that ability to be able to join, you know, to be able to belong to the greater population and be able to go through the school process, whether it's on the reserve or whether it's off the reserve, you know. And I think we need to be mindful that the Aboriginal youth right now are the fastest growing population right now, you know. And I think that's where I begin to align and tie in the whole health and education piece, you know. It's often been said, you know, education is the new bison, you know. We've heard that before many times, you know. And I really believe in that, you know. And I think the majority, if not all of our parents, you know, aspire for their young people, for their children, you know, to be able to maneuver, to be able to stick handle through this whole education system and get their degree and be able to succeed in life, you know. So I think that's the connection between health and education and the ability for our people to see that, you know. But the other side is, you know, I think, you know, we need to also say, you know, that the other party, the greater population needs to acknowledge and understand who we are, you know. I don't think we're ever going to lose our identity, you know. And as my grandfather used to tell me, we're bicultural in nature, so to speak, you know. You've got 1 foot over here, and you've got 1 foot over here. And he also mentioned, you know, that the greatest mechanism that you can unfold is the ability to integrate, you know, those two cultures and live within that and be able to succeed in both cultures, you know. And I see our young people doing that, you know. They've got the greatest advantage, you know. They've got an advantage, they've got the ability, they've got the skill set, you know. Mind you, you know, the data and the population data still doesn't speak well of our young people succeeding in school, the addiction, and of course we all know about the opiate crisis that we have, you know.
Yeah.
But it's not an isolated case, you know, to, let's say, for example, the Blood Tribe, you know. I'm very, very concerned about the opiate and the drug scene globally, you know, and where that's going to take us, you know. But I always say, you know, I think you have to be mindful of your own backyard.
Right.
Take care of your family, take care of your community, like my grandfather said, you know. Continue to work, you know, and make a difference in life for those
where
people.
You can,
where we can,
Right. Thank you for that. Your role as Chancellor seems really well positioned then to allow you to envision some changes in the university and or progress in the university. For me, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's recommendations were really important, and as a non-Indigenous person, a real moment of learning. Like, I thought I knew a decent amount of history, but I've definitely learned since that, and I find it's changing. Do you see the education field changing in response to the TRC? And
maybe directly talk about the University of Lethbridge, you know.
Okay.
We know that since 1975, around that era, you know, the University of Lethbridge embarked on the initiative, you know, of introducing Native studies program and stuff like that, you know. So in my view, people like Dr. Leroy Littlebear and many others, you know, our Aboriginal professors and our teachers, you know, were instrumental in providing, you know, the knowledge to provide a program for Aboriginal students coming in, you know. So I think informally there's been a great deal of work that has already happened before the Truth and Reconciliation process kicked in, you know. So I think the University of Lethbridge has placed themselves in a really good position to continue the work as such, you know. In my view, the Truth and Reconciliation has two components. You know, the first component is the legacy of a residential school, and the second piece is the reconciliation piece. You know, and I think, you know, we've worked hard enough with regards to the legacy, ensuring that we fully understand residential school, the impact of a residential school, the intergenerational effects of a residential school, and the ongoing, you know, systematic barriers, you know, with regards to that, you know. And I think, you know, that work needs to continue to happen, you know. But in my talks, in my discussions, whether it's with industry, whether it's with the health sector, whether it's with education people and our own people, you know, we must be mindful of that legacy, that, you know, that it's there, you know, but they are building blocks to overcome, you know, the hurt and the pain, you know, that was caused for many years, you know. So I think, you know, the aspiration of the Truth and Reconciliation, especially with education, is to try to develop the curriculum, whether at the K-12 level, whether at the higher education, post-secondary education schools, you know, that we continue to understand and ask for acknowledgement to that legacy, you know. And I think once we get the full understanding of what happened back then, I think we can begin to draw, you know, some commonality on how we can work together, you know. And I think, you know, that's a big piece, you know, that the University of Lethbridge and our own tribe, the Blood Tribe, have worked constantly together, you know. The reconciliation piece is quite an important piece, you know, and even I question sometimes my own understanding of reconciliation, just exactly what is reconciliation all about, you know. The government has sort of its content on reconciliation, you know, respecting the rights of Aboriginal people and their treaty rights, respecting the identity of who we are, building a true relationship, government to government, nation to nation, So that's all kind of the formal piece from the government on their understanding.
High level piece.
Yeah, but more important for me is how do you build that rekindling or rebuilding that relationship with your neighbors, for example, the Blood Tribe with Cartson, the Blood Tribe with the city of Lethbridge, and individually and families and neighbors, I think that's the piece that's going to provide, the full reconciliation piece, And I think there has been a great deal of effort that's been happening right now to try to resolve, not just the differences, but trying to identify the commonalities, And there's so many different commonalities that we have, We live in southern Alberta. I classify that as the best environment and land base, that you can have, And I've always said ample times, the Blood Tribe is not going anywhere. City of Lethbridge is not going anywhere. But I think the biggest piece is being able to find those commonalities where we can begin to grow together. We can begin to grow wealth together. We can have our young people getting into the schools, going through the school system, coming out of the school system with a degree so that they can find meaningful jobs and careers, Right. And so there's been a great deal of discussion, with committees, with different groups, in how can we rebuild that relationship, And I know through our University of Lethbridge, there's been continued work to find out, there's ample research, documentation, and data, And I think there's different forms that we can entertain how reconciliation can happen at the schools, how reconciliation can happen at the community, and with the economic development piece, And going back to the health indicators, employment being such a huge indicator of your wealth, And I think that's a discussion that we have, with the industry people, over the ample years, But part of that is, again, training our young people, providing them with skills, And I'm mindful of some of our students who just don't have the inclination to go into post-secondary, but rather go into the trades and skills, those type of things, So I'm also cognizant of those two pathways, for our young people, And this is where the economic development piece comes in, the job skills training, the job-ready programs that are being provided to that, So if you take a look at the Truth and Reconciliation piece, the 94 calls to action, they talk about child welfare, they talk about health, they talk about education, they talk about economic development. They talk about culture and language and so many different things, And I think as a learning institute, at the University of Lethbridge and the surrounding school divisions, I think really need to take a hard look at the curriculum and the base, Because I think if we're going to be able to provide that safe, that caring environment, that belonging environment, we also have to recognize, the history of our Aboriginal people, number one. We also have to understand, our identity, and who we are, I think over the years, I as a person have been able to understand mainstream society and the culture and stuff like that, So I think if we turned around, the understanding.
For me, one of the really standout phrases in the report was that we are all treaty people. And I hate to announce my ignorance to the world, but I hadn't really conceived it in that way previously. And it did change things in the classroom for me, because I think I used to think things like land acknowledgements were for the Native students, the Indigenous students, but of course they're also for the non-Indigenous students, right? Because that treaty is two-sided, and both sets of students. Of course, you know. Yeah. So for me, that did sort of flip things in terms of my perception of them, and were real learning moments for me, which needs to happen. So for me, as an individual instructor, there are a lot of things in the classroom. Maybe we could make it a bit more specific. Are there things you would like university instructors to know, or advice you'd like to give?
I really sense, that number one, our classroom instructors and the community at the University of Lethbridge want to learn and support a better learning environment for our Aboriginal student. I really believe that, Let me just provide you a story. As chief, we have our annual our annual powwow celebration every year, third week in July, and we just had that about a month ago.
Right.
But in one of those years, I thought, what, I'm going to invite the mayors. So I invited the mayor of Cardston, mayor of Lethbridge, mayor of Colehurst, and the mayor of Fort McLeod.
Right.
So I had my teepee and camp set out, and my wife offered refreshments and stuff like that. And they had a good time. We went to see the celebration. We went to see the dancers. We went here and visited, and we talked, But what really struck me at the end was, and I don't remember which mayor said this, is that, Chief, every year, most years I used to drive through here and look at the celebration as I'm driving through. And I can hear the music, I can hear the games, I can hear the drumming and the singing and people and all of that, and the color display of the dancers from afar. I could see that. And I often wondered, I wish somebody would invite me to the powwow celebration. And that really struck a chord in me, because in hindsight, you don't need a formal invitation to come to a powwow. But I would suspect that it's a little bit scary for somebody from Lethbridge or Calgary to walk directly into a celebration with Aboriginal people, And so that got me to thinking, is this how we treat each other? Is this how we know each other? That we have to have a special invitation to come into our camps, to come into our classrooms, and those type of things. So I think, in my view, I think classroom instructors may need to meet with other instructors, especially from the Blood Tribe, and begin the process of understanding, because I believe there's a great deal of similarity in the classroom instructions, and I think just by being able to sit and speak with Aboriginal instructors from the reserve or from different parts of the country will go a long ways, And once you begin to understand the process of how our Aboriginal people are coming into, it's much the same way that I worked with United Way. United Way, a number of years ago, asked me to sit with them and meet with them. And they said, we have a real difficulty trying to treat the Aboriginal patients coming in. They don't understand the system. They're not very talkative. They're not all of this, And I said, well, that's because, some of them are elders. Some of them haven't used the healthcare system, for example, in Calgary for a long time or for a number of times. So again, it's going back to that foreign environment that some of our people are coming into, And it's a matter of trust. It's a matter of respect being able to do that, you know. So what we did was we placed Aboriginal people in each of the major hospitals in Calgary. I believe there was 3 of them, you know. So it was a transition. It was sort of a support, you know. So anybody coming in from the Nakotas, from Stoney, anybody coming in from Siksika, you know, the Aboriginal liaison people will meet and greet and try to get them through the process, you know, whether it's just providing admission requirements and then where you go, you know. So I think a lot of that, you know, some of our Aboriginal students who haven't, who are now entering into post-secondary have those same fears, you know, even with the admission requirements, you know, fill in the application, you know, those type of things, you know. And of course, trying to maneuver and navigate your way through the university, you know, classrooms and stuff like that, and trying to meet new friends and trying to fit in, you know. So
in addition to all the work, right?
Of course,
you know,
all of the work, you know.
Well, and I know the First Nations transition program has had a lot of successes. That's one of the things I think the university's really done to facilitate Indigenous students' comfort in the classrooms. Are there other things that you'd like to see in that you'd like to be on board developing in your role as Chancellor for the university?
Of course, and I think the acknowledgement piece, you know, is a good starting point, you know, and just having our Aboriginal students knowing, you know, that there's a recognition of our history, our treaties, you know, where we come from, our identity, you know. And I think one of the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation is the government and institutions, learning institutions, to develop a curriculum, you know, base with regards to Aboriginal history, Aboriginal component into there. So I think those are strong fields, you know, and I think what we may try to take a look at from my position as Chancellor, and just by the way, we're going to have our first Senate meeting on the blood reserve.
Oh, great!
In October at the high school, you know. So that's
talk
part
about
of
inviting people out.
Yeah, and I think what we're going to do, the President and I, and a few of the Senate people are going to talk to the students, you know, prior to the meeting, you know. So that's part of the community outreach, community engagement, you know. So I think for success to happen, you know, I think we need to take a multi approach to the whole thing, you know. I think it's easy to understand that the only way you can get to post-secondary is through the K-12 classrooms and through, you know. So I think having some of our instructors, our technicians from the University of Lethbridge maybe doing that community outreach and preparing the young students, you know, for their career pathways, you know. This is what to expect when you're at post-secondary, you know.
I mean, that's a universal, right? Like making the students feel comfortable, because students don't learn when they're not comfortable.
And understanding that process. How do you get from there to here, you know? And that's the same thing with United Way, you know, just navigating our people, you know, through the system. And that's the same thing at university, navigating them through the system. And like I said earlier, the University of Lethbridge have a really good, strong start with the Aboriginal transition program, you know. That support is so much required, you know. And I think, you know, I think there's a tremendous amount of people that have gone through, you know, both the Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal students, you know. There's a number of role models, there's people here that can help, you know. And I think, you know, the seamless boundary between the Blood Tribe and Lethbridge, you know, there's, you know, many of our people are here and living in Lethbridge, and they own homes and they have jobs and stuff like that, you know. So I think it's happening already.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I'm very happy to see in the course of my career the number of Indigenous students rising in the university. I see more and more Indigenous students in my class. And I'm interested that you mentioned the United Way because I'm on the board of the local United
wow.
Way. I think it's a really great organization, so we share that. One of the things that for me in the classroom I know I don't do well is, like, I've heard a lot about Indigenous ways of knowing and the idea that Indigenous learning in traditional forms takes slightly different patterns than an academic way. What do you think about that, about Indigenous ways of knowing and how the university might expand on its Indigenous ways of knowing?
You know, I think there's a number of different options that are already happening, you know. I know the University of Calgary, for example, will invite an elder to come in, you know, and provide sort of a traditional history 101, so to speak, you know. And I think it forms the basis of that understanding and that connection between instructor, student, and student to student, both from the Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal students, you know. And if I can underline this, you know, I think if we can begin to hear the stories, begin to hear the history, it's a fascinating history about my people, you know. And I think we just need to go down that road and understand that, you know. And I think once that begins to happen, I think we can begin to share, you know, the same pathways to where we want our young people to be, you know. And of course, you know, working with being the chief and grand chief for a number of years, you know, I think the government still plays a real major part in the whole thing, you know, whether it's funding, whether it's policy, legislation, you know, those type of things, you know. So I'm glad, you know, that our leadership continue to work with the government, both the provincial and the federal government, you know, to try to get to that place, you know, where policies, legislation, and funding are not barriers, you know, because both you and I know, you know, that it's more economically feasible if you invest in education for our young people. And not doing that, you know, is going to create that whole poverty, that whole addiction, you know, and the cost of that is far more.
Absolutely.
Than
the cost
the
both
side.
in monetary terms and in human
resource,
and our shared humanity as well, right? The loss of,
you know. And you're right about the shared humanity, you know, because in my view, if Aboriginal people succeed, everybody succeeds, you know.
Absolutely. Like, we need everyone in our community having access to success and able to achieve it. So in terms of the move into the Chancellor position, what does that allow you to do in Lethbridge? Like, you've talked about outreach to the community, but are there things in Lethbridge with the local Lethbridge community that you'll also be interested in exploring?
Of course, you know, I think that's part of, you know, being able to do community outreach, and not for just the Aboriginal population, but for the non-Aboriginal population, you know. So I do know quite a few people in Lethbridge because of my past position as chief, of course, you know. And we've worked with a town of Cardston, and just a reminder that Cardston had their annual powwow celebration with our blood tribe, you know. So
I did not know that Cardston had a powwow
those
celebration.
are the type of things that are happening right now, you know. So
it's about building
I think,
relations.
Exactly,
Nice.
So I think it's important for me to be transparent to the community in Lethbridge, with the tribes, you know, and sort of within the Alberta base, you know. And I think I've got a good head start being chief for 12 years, like I said before. And I think that provides me with that sort of a base to continue to do that, you know. And of course, I'm open to meet with people. I'm open to discuss, you know, with people and stuff like that. I'm still very much involved with our education system, not just with the Aboriginal education system, but how we can build on the education system so that that retention and that success of our numbers go through, into post-secondary education. And of course, we still have the dilemma with the opioid crisis, with our people here living, unfortunately, on the street, so I'm in close contact with Lethbridge, with Cardston, and just putting our heads together and being mindful of the respect, and dignity, that we must provide, So how do we move and transition those people, Because I think if we did a triage of who they are and what they're about, I wouldn't be a bit surprised if some of them are university material to go into that direction, but our young people,
addiction hits every segment of society, right?
Everybody, and that's just not just our Aboriginal population.
Absolutely, yeah. That's interesting in terms of like the holistic view of it, because I think maybe as an instructor, I'm looking at more in terms of my classroom and my department's curriculum, but you have a much broader view of these things, which is why you're Chancellor and I'm not. One of the kind of phrases or two of the phrases that we hear a lot around the university are decolonizing the curriculum or indigenizing the curriculum. What do those phrases mean to you, and maybe do they even set up any red flags?
Well, for me, like you said, they're phrases,
Yeah.
I just want to build on, just currently what's happening right now at the University of Lethbridge, A great professor and doctor to have is Dr. Leroy Littlebear,
Foundational in this school.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. I think with Dr. Littlebear and other Aboriginal scholars and the University of Lethbridge have built on that,
Right.
And what does it mean to me? I think it means breaking down the walls of those differences, between you and I, the cultures, the communities, So that's the best way that I can phrase it, breaking down the walls.
Right.
Of knowing who we are and how can we build the relationship together, Mind you, we have different sets of world views, And again, pointing out, if we can go down that road and understanding those views, from both perspectives, I think we can begin to see how we can explore, how we can break down those walls, and stuff like that, And I think it's so important for our young Aboriginal youth, the youth that is growing in numbers, because I think they want to think beyond residential school.
Right.
I think they want to think beyond, the status quo right now, And the status quo of Aboriginal life is still not good, whether you take a look at health outcomes, educational outcomes, economic development, job and employment, those type of things, So,
but the university can be such a positive thing in all of those, right?
In all of those, And I think where I see kind of the challenge is, how do we go about this without, without stepping on toes, without the proper protocols and stuff like that, So I think part of that curriculum and that understanding how we need to explore those protocols from each other,
Right.
And that takes perhaps a little bit of more togetherness to work towards that, So in the form of decolonization and the other piece, it's breaking down those walls.
Right.
So that we can begin to have that discussion. We can begin to have collaboration, at that level where everybody is mindful that we want that student to live a happy life, growing up, safe, caring environment, go to school, succeed through school, still have both of their base, their Aboriginal base, and understanding the mainstream base and going through the education process, caring for their families, having meaning input and stuff like that.
Right. Earlier in this series, I interviewed Michelle Hogue, who teaches in the First Nations Transition Program and talks about it as two-eyed, right? That you always have to be looking both ways. And it seems like that's being able to facilitate students who are able to have one foot in both cultures, one eye in both ways of seeing.
And I'm really confident about our young people, you know. I don't think we need to hold their hands through the process, through the system. I think the greater the piece is they're mindful that they're being understood, they're being recognized, they're being cared about. I think that's going to take them a long ways to go through the system, you know, where there don't need to be special things or pilot project things or those type of things. I think they're smart enough, they're brave enough to go through the system.
Well, and to me, a lot of things that that I'm interested in terms of good pedagogy are true for all students, right? Like, you know, creating a classroom where people don't feel silenced is that's about every student in that classroom. And we might be particularly interested in Indigenous students in some contexts, but it's always true that you want to not shut out your students, right?
And then basing it on my own experience, you know, I went to the residential school from grade 1 to 11.
Wow.
So grade 12, I went to high school in Calgary.
Wow.
And then those fears come out when I went
must
to
have been
Calgary.
quite a shift.
You know, it was a great transition for me. But I tell you, one thing that I carried forward was that whole health, that health and well-being.
Right.
I was a good athlete in basketball. You know? So I joined the high school basketball team, and that sort of opened the doors for you know, being able to succeed, being able to be a part of that group. You know, so I think it's second nature to our young people now. You know. Right.
Well, and I think, I mean, we talk sometimes in the education circles about high impact activities, like things that on campus that really give students essentially a home, right?
Yes.
Where they so often it's a student club or or their major where they really feel grounded, and finding ways where we can help students feel grounded in this university, like this is their place, we're here for them, is to me really important. So do you have any ideas about how the university might do that better?
Well, at this point, I think it's also a learning experience for me with regards to how the University of Lethbridge is set up, you know, but taking a closer look at the individuals from my community that have gone through the system and the experiences and stuff like that, you know. A lot of them will tell you at the University of Lethbridge, because it's close to home. We're from this area where we know exactly, you know, what the environment is about, and being able to go through the system was a good learning experience, you know. So I think, and I just want to perhaps maybe close off by saying, you know, University of Lethbridge has been sort of a real foundational piece with regards to the blood tribe and education, you know. Many of our teachers that are teaching in our school system on the reserve come from University of Lethbridge, you know, so there's a real connection, you know. I think the only thing aside, you know, from that working relationship with the university, again, is going back to that piece with the government, you know. So any given year, you know, we probably have about 700 applications just from our tribe for university entrance. But we're only able to fund 45 to 50% of those, you know. So the majority are on waiting lists, and you know what that happens.
It's discouraging,
you know. It's discouraging,
people filter
and somebody
out.
just
Never
come back, you know.
Well, and we know on campus how many of our students who are living in poverty or are, you know, working full-time and more to support their education. And it isn't setting themselves up for success. We aren't setting them up for success as a society if we're expecting them to work full time and go to it's so for getting those pieces in place so that they are positioned to be able to succeed is essential.
Exactly. And earlier you talk about the holistic piece, and that's what needs to happen. Like all these departments, health, education, economic development, they all need to work together, because again, it's not just it's also transportation. It's also trying to
and
work
that's a big
with legal issues, family type of issues, back home,
Right.
So all of these put together is a real barrier for our young people, But I think as we progress, we work together, I think we're going to find, our Aboriginal students are going to have a better learning experience, and the outcomes are going to be greater, I believe.
Right. Well, thank you so much for being here today. I found that was really fascinating. I learned a lot. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and knowledge with me.
Thank you, Anne, for the invite.
Thanks, Charlie.